Hi, I'm Rory, and this presentation is named after my new book, Enlightenment Made Simple, An Introduction to Advaita Vedanta. I thought it would be nice to tie in with the book and provide a brief overview of the topic of enlightenment and Vedanta. So what I'm going to do is provide an entry point for those unfamiliar with the topic, and a helpful overview of the key points for existing students. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that this talk is heavily inspired by a lecture given by Swami Paramarthananda, who is without doubt one of the best Vedanta teachers alive today. The Swami was talking about the essence of the Upanishads and did a customarily beautiful way of unfolding and laying out the key elements. So I'm very much following his lead. Now, knowledge very often begins with a question. The first big question in this case is, of course, what is enlightenment? Let's be clear, enlightenment is a very loaded word, much like the word God. That makes it something of a difficult word. It's a word used by a lot of people and a number of different traditions, but the definition differs wildly depending upon who's using it. As I note in the introduction of my new book, while enlightenment is heralded as the goal of all goals by spiritual seekers, there's surprisingly little consensus about what it actually is. What I'm going to try to do by the end of this talk is to demystify it and provide a clear, cohesive and logical definition of what it is, why it's desirable, and how it can be attained. Now, forgetting enlightenment for a second, we'll come back to that. The first question we really need to concern ourselves with is, what do we want in life? For you can't understand enlightenment without first understanding the basic goals and motivations common to all human beings. And not just human beings, but also animals and all living beings in general. Human beings have a lot more in common with animals than we have differences. We all seek food, shelter, rest and sleep, and even love and connection. At least certain animals do. Some aren't quite as affectionate. So another point is we all suffer a basic sense of insecurity when it comes to the world, the environment. And that's because we know the world and the environment around us contains dangers, threats to our survival. So we always have to be on our guard and to protect ourselves from things and situations that might cause us harm. Finally, human beings and animals, and basically all living beings, have the imperative to reproduce, to continue the species through offspring. These are all instinctive drives. Animals and human beings both operate via instinct. It's built into us, existing as our inherent inner knowledge of how to live, survive, and hopefully thrive. So what is it that separates humans and animals? The answer is simple. Human beings have a more developed intellect. It's this faculty of intellect that allows us to think abstractly and to reason, to project ahead, and to plan for the future. It's the intellect that also allows us to be self-reflective, to have a self-concept and a self-image, to conceive of ourselves as a separate and reasonably autonomous being. Now this of course can be both a blessing and a curse, because it's courtesy of the intellect. There's now the possibility that we might feel inferior or superior to other people, which can obviously create tremendous problems for us, emotionally and in our relationships. That's something that birds and mice don't have to worry about. They're just fine as they are. Dogs and cats don't have an idea that they're somehow superior or inferior to each other. You'll never meet a spaniel with an inferiority complex, or a pigeon with self-esteem issues. So this capacity for self-reflection is at the root of a great deal of our troubles and conflicts as human beings. But our intellect gives us self-reflectivity and the capacity for free will. This means that we have the ability to make choices. Unlike animals, we don't live by instinct alone. Because we have the added component of a refined intellect, we have the ability to make choices. Let's illustrate this. Vedanta outlines the first goal of human life as basic security. This is our primary goal because we need to be safe and free from harm. We won't be interested in any other goals if we haven't first taken care of our basic survival needs. This imperative is common to all living beings, from the biggest of mammals to the tiniest of cellular organisms. All living beings have an innermost instinct to survive, to avoid threats to their well-being, and to continue living. Now, if we don't take care of this need for security and basic well-being, our lives will be extremely difficult and fraught by continual insecurity and suffering. At the most basic level, the primary aspects of security are having food and shelter. Without those, you've got nothing, and that's the same for animals and humans alike. The way we go about this goal is, of course, quite different. Animals, as I've said, are governed by instinct, so they don't have to give much thought to the type of shelter and food they're after. It's built into their design. All creatures have their own way of doing things as determined by instinct and programmed instructions. They're not going to switch things up just because they feel bored. A fish, for example, won't decide to start living on land. Similarly, a bird won't try its hand living underwater. That just wouldn't work out. It's not even an option. Animals are content to live according to their nature. It's different for human beings, of course, because we love to exercise our faculty for choice and free will. Whereas animals build their homes according to inbuilt instinct, human beings, possessing the capacity for choice, will create accommodation for themselves in an incredible variety of ways. And what amazing choices we have. You might live in a small house or a big house. Heck, you could live in one of those little tiny houses or a sprawling mansion if you have the money. A caravan or a castle. In the country away from civilization or in the middle of a bustling city. You can live at ground level or the top floor of a skyscraper. There's so much to choose from. The same's true when it comes to food. Animals are set up to eat certain foods, whether they're carnivores or herbivores, and they'll usually only deviate from that out of necessity. That's why you don't see animals writing recipe books to broaden their culinary choices. Human beings, on the other hand, love and cherish choice. We don't all eat the same thing. In fact, when you set foot in a restaurant, you expect multiple options, and you'd be greatly disappointed if there wasn't. Imagine if a restaurant served everyone the same food. I'm guessing you'd be straight on to TripAdvisor to complain. So we love to exercise our capacity for choice in an endless number of ways. From the clothes that we wear and our fashion choices, to the car we drive and the way we decorate our homes, the way we spend our time, the way we entertain ourselves, the objects we acquire and the places we want to travel. The faculty of intellect is what accounts for the enormous diversity exhibited by our species. Now, because we can choose, we have an incredible number of goals available to us. Vedanta categorizes human goals into 4 categories. Security, which is artha in Sanskrit, which we've just covered. Once we've attained our security needs, we tend to focus on kama, pleasure and enjoyment, entertainment. And the third goal or pursuit is what we call dharma, which basically means doing the right thing and contributing back to society in some way. Whatever category the goals fall into, we're constantly making choices. Now here's the first big point I want you to grasp. Even though it appears we have an almost infinite number of different goals, there's ultimately only one goal. And this one goal is common to all living beings. So what is this goal? In spite of our many and varied objectives, what we're actually seeking is happiness. We want to be happy. We want to feel good. The term the Vedantic scriptures use for this happiness is ananda. Ananda is a tricky word to translate. It's generally translated as bliss, but people can get a little bit confused about bliss because the word has certain connotations and may give the impression that someone is floating around as if they're high on drugs or in some altered state of consciousness. It could be described as happiness, although happiness isn't quite strong enough a word. People experience happiness when they eat a good meal, or watch their favorite TV show, or their favorite sports team wins a match. We all experience this kind of happiness as we go through life. The kind of happiness that comes and goes. The happiness that's based, as its name suggests, on happenings. Ananda is more than just temporary situational happiness. It's a happiness that doesn't come and go. It's a permanent sense of well-being, of wholeness, contentment, and fulfillment. It's the sense that nothing is lacking. The sense that we don't need anything more than we already have. It's a complete satisfaction and fullness. That's ananda. That's what we're all seeking. Not temporary little scraps of happiness, but a complete and lasting happiness. So while our goals are many and varied at a superficial level, our ultimate goal is this lasting happiness. All our goals are but a means to this one specific end. Now, human nature being what it is, we all have preferences for specific things, objects, situations, and relationships. That's very much the way we're conditioned and brought up. And once we attain these things, the objects of our desires, we expect them to bring us happiness. We see these things, these objects, as the source of our joy. Is that true, however? The problem is all things, all objects, are temporary in nature. They don't deliver joy forever, or even necessarily for very long. And when they cease delivering joy, when it becomes clear that these things aren't, in fact, the source of our joy, our love for them will dry up pretty quickly. For example, Maybe you spend years saving for a wonderful dream house in the country. And while you're happy for a while, you eventually decide it's not right for you, so you put it up for sale and look for somewhere else. Maybe it costs too much to heat, or the location isn't convenient enough, or you've got horrible neighbors. Maybe you find yourself quitting what seemed like the greatest job in the world because they keep making you work overtime. Or you find yourself serving your once cherished husband or wife with divorce papers because you can't stand living with them and all their awful habits, and you're eager to hop onto Tinder to find another, better partner. If any of these things, these objects, and anything external to you we classify as an object, if any of them had been the source of your happiness, if the happiness was intrinsic to them, they'd have continued to be a source of happiness. The happiness would be constant, but it's not. There's a honeymoon period, and then there's waking up to the cold, hard fact that everything has its upside and its downside, and is incapable of delivering lasting happiness. The cold, hard fact about life. So we haven't attained our actual goal, Ananda. We haven't got the thing we actually wanted. Here's the next key point. There are two ways a human being can go about attaining happiness. The first is externally, through the attainment of various objects, situations, and relationships. The second is something that will only occur to those who are aware of life's fourth and highest goal, enlightenment, or liberation. This is when we attain our lasting happiness, our Ananda, not externally, but internally from our own self. The scriptures call this Atma Ananda. Atma means self. So Atma Ananda essentially means self-derived happiness. Object-based happiness is derived from things, objects, and it's from these objects you're seeking to extract happiness. It's an externally derived happiness. You will of course be able to enjoy a certain measure of happiness if the object of your desire conforms to your wants and expectations. If you manage, for instance, to get what you want and keep it. But the downsides of this externally derived happiness are clear. Because it's derived from the external world, it's an incidental happiness. It's a temporary, limited, borrowed happiness. It is therefore impermanent and always subject to loss. If you're reliant on externally derived happiness, you are dependent on external variables being a certain way and remaining that way. And when they no longer align, when they change as they inevitably will, before you know it, your happiness turns to sorrow. The honeymoon is over. So object-based happiness is always temporary, and it's always mixed with sorrow, like two sides of the same coin. It also requires work. There's inevitably an element of effort involved. In order to get what you want, you have to exert a certain amount of effort in order to acquire it. The pain doesn't stop there, however, because you then have to preserve and maintain it, to hold on to it once you've acquired it. Those are the first two types of pain involved in object-based happiness. The third type of pain is the pain of eventual loss, when you lose the object of your desire. There's just no getting around this trinity of sorrows, which are part and parcel of life in duality. So let's consider the alternative. Happiness derived from the self alone. This happiness doesn't come from objects. It comes from our own essential nature. It's intrinsic to what you are, what you truly are, and is therefore not subject to gain or loss. It's already there. It can never not be there. This immediately bypasses the fear of loss and the pain inherent in having to gain and preserve it. There's no struggle involved in getting something that's always there, and no fear of losing it either. So it's up to us, using our faculty of free will, of choice, to choose between these two ways of attaining happiness and wholeness. It's really a no-brainer though, isn't it? An intelligent person will see how precarious happiness is if it's reliant on external variables. Things, people, situations, and circumstances that we cannot ultimately control. That's in fact a recipe for disaster. We actually have a word for it, samsara. Samsara essentially means being reliant on external things in order to be happy. And that's the root of seemingly endless suffering for us. When it comes to happiness and pretty much all things, it's wisest to be self-sufficient, where you can, rather than relying on other things, other variables, which you then become prisoner to. Being dependent on anything outside of yourself always comes with problems, including near permanent insecurity and anxiety. We know we have only limited control of our environment and the world. Therefore, we're constantly worried that we're going to lose what we think we need in order to be happy. That's before we even do lose it. Object-based happiness is always tainted by the knowledge that it's not permanent. So it's colored by the fear and anxiety of losing it. Now, this is pretty much how we define enlightenment. The Sanskrit term for enlightenment is moksha, which translates directly as liberation. And that's arguably a better term than enlightenment. But liberation from what? Liberation from dependency on other things for your happiness. When you become self-sufficient with regard to your happiness, your wholeness and fulfillment, you become free of objects, free of other people, circumstances and situations. You no longer have to struggle so desperately and vainly to get the outer world to match up to your needs, desires, and compulsions. Liberation is liberation from dependency on external variables, from unhappiness, insecurity and fear, and anything that binds and brings you sorrow. Above all, it's freedom from the notion that who and what you are is inherently lacking, limited, and insufficient. It's the knowledge that you're actually fine just as you are, that you have enough, and that you are enough, that you are totally whole and complete in yourself, that the ananda, the bliss, wholeness, and freedom you seek is inherent to your own nature. As such, it's always there, always available. Of course, if you're new to this, if you're a regular worldly person, I don't expect you to believe me. For the vast majority of human beings, it certainly won't seem to be true that the self is the source of happiness. the self may in fact seem to be a source of tremendous misery and suffering. So how do you get this self-derived happiness, this liberation? That's another important question. Swami Paramarthananda uses the analogy of a house and its water supply. The water is available on tap. There's a full tank of water and all the necessary plumbing in place. So when you turn on the tap, you immediately get water. It's already there, just waiting for you to turn a valve and release the flow. Now, if you happen to turn on the tap and no water comes out, what can you immediately assume? You know the water's there, sitting in the tank, but there's clearly a blockage somewhere in the pipes. This obstacle or obstruction is preventing you from getting the water that is otherwise yours. Likewise, when the freedom and wholeness of your own self is seemingly absent, when there's what seems to be a block or obstacle somewhere, you might be forgiven for thinking that it's not there, even though it has to be there, because it's your own self, and your self can never not be there. The solution? You need to remove what's covering or veiling it. You need to remove the blockages, the obstacles. Vedanta outlines 3 main obstacles to the attainment of liberation. These obstacles are mental impurity, mental restlessness, and ignorance. The first problem we have to overcome is impurity of mind. The Sanskrit term for this is mala. Now, these mental impurities are innumerable, but they can be boiled down to 2 basic things. What we call our raga dvesas. This is usually translated as our likes and dislikes. It's actually much stronger than just likes and dislikes, however. I might say that I like tea and dislike coffee, which is fine. It's not going to cause my life to collapse down around me if I can't get a cup of tea. Raga means more than just a like. It means a burning desire, an attachment, something that has you completely hooked. Dvesas is also more than just a dislike. It's an aversion, something that creates significant mental unrest and agitation if you have to face it. Whether it's a desire or aversion, both have you enslaved, and both have a real impact in shaping your experience of life. They're the push and pull that can totally warp the mind and psyche. This is the source of tremendous agitation and suffering. What happens is we become so under the sway of these desires and aversions that we try to coerce and manipulate the world into conforming to our desires and wants. And while we're likely to have our victories and defeats, it's not a good strategy in the long run, because we ultimately don't have that much control over the variables. And this leads to the second obstacle. Our desires and aversions lead to mental restlessness, distraction, and lack of peace. The scriptures call this vikshepa. I guess a modern term would be stress, something common to virtually everyone on the planet. The mind becomes insecure, anxious, fickle, and prone to wandering. We're unable to focus our attention. Our attention gets pulled here and there, like a feather in the wind. It's hard to get anywhere when you lack a steady, abiding mind. The third obstacle is what we generally define as our primary obstacle, ignorance, specifically self-ignorance. Ignorance of the fact that our true nature is Ananda, wholeness, completeness, and that we don't require anything outside of us in order to be happy. Ignorance is the greatest enemy, the main block in the pipe that prevents us from enjoying the peace and wholeness of our own nature. When I say that it's a block, it's important to note that ignorance isn't some tangible thing. Ignorance is a lack of something, a lack of knowledge, just as darkness is a lack of light. This ignorance is impersonal. We're basically all born into ignorance because we're born into a world of duality, which effectively hides the truth of our own being from us. The Sanskrit term for this is avarana, or veiling, for ignorance veils the truth of what we are from us. Our senses are automatically hooked to the external world, and we accordingly take appearance to be real. We see and experience a body and mind, what we call a gross and subtle body. And through ignorance, we superimpose our sense of self, our sense of identity, or amness, onto these objects, these vehicles or instruments. This creates a whole world of suffering for us. When we identify with limited adjuncts, which is what the body and mind are, we identify with their limitations. Their limitations, their finiteness, their pains and sorrows become ours. We become limited, lacking, and subject to pain and sorrow. So these are the three obstacles to the realization of our true nature: mental impurity, mental restlessness, and ignorance. Now here's the big question. How do we deal with these obstacles in order to realize our true nature? This is a little pyramid I designed called the Pyramid of Self-Realization. This is an outline of the whole spiritual path according to Vedanta. It contains all the necessary steps in sequential order necessary to remove these obstacles and lead us to liberation, to the realization of the wholeness of our true nature. Let's briefly explore each. Dharma sits at the bottom of the pyramid because it's that which should underlie everything else. It's the foundation of everything, the foundation of life itself. Dharma is a Sanskrit word with no real translation, and it has multiple meanings depending on the context. Now, interestingly, the Vedantic scriptures don't say very much about Dharma outside of the Bhagavad Gita. And that's because a full understanding of and commitment to Dharma is assumed, is presupposed. Dharma was an intrinsic part of the Vedic culture, something everyone in society understood. It was instilled into the people from a young age and very much pervaded the culture. All the great stories which were passed down from generation to generation, such as the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and later the Puranas, were designed not just to entertain, but to teach the value and importance of Dharma. That way, Dharma was ingrained into the culture. At the most basic level, Dharma means doing the right thing at the right time, in the right way. It means responding to each situation appropriately and being willing to contribute to life rather than just extracting what you can from life. Dharma is basically the moral law underlying the entire cosmos. It means responding to life in a way that benefits not just ourselves but other people, other beings, and society and the world around us. And it also means following our nature and being true to ourselves. One of my favorite chapters in my new book is the chapter on Dharma and values. Because Dharma basically means having good, healthy values. And that's important because our values determine how we respond to life. They essentially shape our lives. The book outlines the 20 core values that are necessary to live a good and harmonious life, and to prepare the mind for the following steps in the pyramid. Next is karma yoga. It's really essential that all spiritual seekers have a good understanding of karma yoga and how to practice it. To summarize very briefly, karma means action. It means what we do, from the big important undertakings to the small little actions that make up our everyday lives. The 3 basic steps of karma yoga are to, first of all, cultivate gratitude for all that you have and all that you've been given in life. This alone creates a radical shift in mindset. It completely transforms the way you see everything and is an instant happiness booster. Even when life is at its hardest, there's always so much we have to be grateful for, whether it's simply having a roof over your head and food to eat, or having a family and people that love you. Secondly, offer all your actions, however small or big, as an offering, as a gift to God, Ishwar, the universe, or whatever you call the creative intelligence that creates and sustains the universe, including our bodies and minds. To that divine intelligence we owe everything. Finally, we offer up not only the action itself, but the results of that action, of all actions. The Bhagavad Gita tells us to accept what comes with grace, whether it be success or failure. What karma yoga does is neutralize the stress inherent in worldly living, in trying to control so many variables over which we ultimately have little or no control. One way to respond to that fact is to stress, to be anxious and emotionally disturbed. Another better way to respond to it is to practice karma yoga. It's really an essential prerequisite for any spiritual seeker, and you won't get far without it. That's because karma yoga is the remedy to the first of our 3 obstructions to self-derived happiness. Remember, the first obstruction is the mental disturbance caused by the tyranny of our desires and aversions. Upasana yoga is our solution to the second obstacle, the unfocused, restless, emotionally disturbed mind. Upasana yoga essentially means meditating, or fixing the mind upon God, upon the creative intelligence responsible for the creation of the universe, the cosmos, all the stars and galaxies, our world, and us as individual beings. Many people get skittish at the word God. That's understandable, but Vedanta deals with the question of God in a very logical and coherent way. The name is unimportant. Vedanta uses the term Ishwara, but what's important is to cultivate a devotional mindset, a mindset of being grateful to the creative intelligence of life for bestowing us with everything that we have, all the many blessings, large or small, that we have in life. This is also called bhakti or devotion, which many see as a path in itself. In traditional Vedanta, it's just part of the path, and is an excellent way of purifying the mind and preparing us for the next and highest step in the pyramid. Vedanta. We don't jump straight to Vedanta. We have to climb our way up to it, which means first ensuring that we have a prepared mind, a fertile mind, a mind capable of grasping this teaching. And Vedanta is our solution to ignorance. Ignorance being our prime enemy and the reason we suffer so much in life. The reason we see the self as a source of problems rather than the source of joy. These initial steps in the ladder don't lead to freedom, to enlightenment themselves, but they lead us to the final step, which we call Jnana Yoga, the yoga of self-knowledge, or Vedanta. And what is Vedanta? Vedanta is derived from the Vedas, the voluminous spiritual texts of ancient India. The Vedas are a massive and all-encompassing body of knowledge on just about everything. The very word Veda means knowledge. There are 4 Vedas, called the Rig Veda, the Sama Veda, the Atharva Veda, and the Yajur Veda. Each can be divided into 2 sections. The first section, which is by far the largest, is called Veda Purva, which means the start of the Vedas. This first section deals with worldly life, and basically covers the first 3 rungs on the ladder. It deals with Dharma, Karma Yoga, and Upasana Yoga. The first section of the Vedas are basically about living a good, dharmic, spiritual, contributory way of life, something that insulates us from the stresses of worldly life. The closing section of the Vedas is called Vedanta, which means the end of the Vedas. This is abbreviated to Vedanta, and it takes the form of what we call the Upanishads. The Upanishads are scriptures which deal with the topic not of action, but of knowledge, specifically self-knowledge. This is the key, because our problem all along was one of ignorance, self-ignorance. We don't enjoy the wholeness and joy of our own self until we first remove self-ignorance. This ignorance is the idea that what we are is a body, mind, and ego, and not the consciousness or awareness in which they appear. This consciousness or awareness is the self, the essence of our being, what we truly are. It has no limitations. Vedanta makes it clear that contrary to the claims of the materialist, consciousness is not a part, product, or property of the body. It exists independently of the body, and exists whether the body is there or not. It isn't confined to physicality, for it's a transcendent principle. Consciousness is birthless, and therefore deathless. And it has no limitations, no boundaries. Therefore, there's no suffering to it. It's free of limitation, defect, and suffering. That's the essential message of Vedanta. In addition to the Upanishads, we have the Bhagavad Gita and the Brahma Sutra, which are the 2 other scriptures that comprise the trinity of Vedantic source texts. There are also a great many secondary and tertiary texts as well, but those are the big 3. This knowledge is said to be our Purushaya, which means it's not of the human intellect. In short, it wasn't cooked up by some person or group of people. It's not philosophy or conjectured discourse. It is revealed knowledge. The rishis who transcribed the Vedas acted almost like radio receivers. As yogis with extremely pure, subtle minds, they would enter extremely deep meditation where they received the mantras. These mantras were then preserved and transmitted from generation to generation in a very sophisticated and precise way that basically made them incorruptible. This knowledge doesn't change like Chinese whispers as it moves from person to person. The mantras are recited according to very specific and exact meters, and this ensures that the knowledge is set in stone. It's eternal knowledge. Although the Upanishads contain this self-knowledge, it's not something that can be gained easily. The thing is, you can't make it on your own. Self-study doesn't work with Vedanta. Ignorance is just too implacable, and it will color and distort the way you approach the teaching. In short, ignorance will likely do the interpreting for you. So you need a guide, a teacher, somebody who can systematically unfold the teaching and then help you resolve any confusions and doubts. It's no coincidence that the Upanishads generally take the form of dialogues between teacher and student, in which this knowledge is passed down and any areas of confusion and doubt on the part of the student are skillfully eradicated. Once you have a qualified teacher, you progress through the 3 stages of Vedanta, which are, first of all, listening. The first step is to simply sit and be open to receive the teaching. Your job is to set aside all prejudice and preconceptions and to keep your mind open, receptive, and fixed upon what is being taught. That alone can be more challenging than you might imagine. That's why we need the preceding yogas to deal with the first 2 obstacles of an impure and restless mind. They prepare you for this, the yoga of self-knowledge. Secondly, reasoning. The second step is to make sure that you fully understand what's been taught and to resolve any doubts, confusion, or misunderstanding which may naturally arise over the course of the teaching. You can sometimes do this through your own self-reflection, but you may often need the help of a teacher, and that's what they're there for. This is an important point. It all has to make perfect sense to you. Blind faith is useless. You have to really see and understand how the logic of it all fits together. This isn't just another belief system. It's knowledge. You have to know the truth of this teaching in order for it to work for you. The final stage is contemplation or Vedantic meditation, whereby you take the self-knowledge, the message of the Upanishads, and contemplate it, meditate upon it, reflect upon it until, basically, this self-knowledge overwrites the old patterns of ignorance. Swami Paramarthananda calls it self-opinion revision meditation. I tend to liken it to installing a new operating system on your computer. You first uninstall the old software, which was based on ignorance, and then gradually install your new, knowledge-based operating system. When you manage to successfully do that, you'll find that the way you view yourself, life, and the world changes forever. What self-knowledge does is remove the limitations caused by ignorance and turn on the tap to the wholeness and happiness that is your own nature. You no longer need to seek happiness outside of yourself, for you found an unending and unlimited supply of it within your own true self, which is pure consciousness. Consciousness without beginning or end, without limitation or defect. Just consciousness, that which is. To summarize, what Vedanta is saying is this: true and lasting happiness, fulfillment, and freedom from sorrow come from your own self, and we can prove it to you. This happiness is not dependent on the world, objects, and other people being a certain way. It's a self-derived happiness. And because yourself is always there, always available, this freedom is always available to you. It's always on tap. And if any blockages should arise, you know how to remove them again, because we've given you the preparatory yogas and the knowledge that neutralizes all suffering. By removing all the ignorant notions you have about the self, what Vedanta will do is prove to you that basically the self is free. You are the self. Therefore, you are free. When you remove the ignorance that's prevented you from apprehending this truth, you realize that you're actually always and forever whole and complete in yourself. Only thoughts of ignorance in the mind can take that away from you. And they don't really take it away. They just obscure it, like a cloud passing over the sun. The sun is always there. And so is the self. So are you. That's liberation. That's enlightenment. That's why Vedanta exists. Thank you for watching.